That's better. Or is it? Okay, yeah, it is. Okay. Or is it? I don't know. Well, let's just get the music on. There we are then. Benny Goodman from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel, where we will be on Saturday. Evening, everybody. Hey, Karen. Hey, Martin. Hey, Kathleen. Everybody say hi to Miles down here. Miles up here now. Miles been driving me nuts. Why do you always want to come when I'm sitting in that chair? I'm trying to get some actual work done. Hey, Mom. Hey, Portia. Hey, Gladys, Luann, Paula, Timberly. Hey, Paula. And first of all, one of Irving Berlin's greatest hits. Evening, Geraldine. Evening, Paula. Hey, Joanne. And bingo night. 064. Before and after. Grandpa Carl would always say. So watch out for pirates, they cheat at bingo. Hey, Alan, Milwaukee. Hey, Timothy. Evening, everybody. Hey, Lisa. Hey, Jeannie. Hey, Timberly. Hey, Kathy. Hey, Frosters in Tinley Park. Hey, Casey. Yes, you should be packing. Yeah, Miles. Tornado warnings, Brigadoon. Well, you got a basement there, right? If not, just try to go limp. Hey, Jennifer. Hey, Gary. Miles. Big stretch. Well, I'm on the couch. I'm just sitting around. I got him so well trained, he only wants to bug me when I'm on the computer. Hey, Bob. Just look at this guy. Yawning and purring. Hey, Diane. I'll see you at the con. Book discussion. You know what I think about books. Hey, Betsy. Now watch out, the Carolinas look like it's going to get rough. Also, if you're there, check your voter registration. Marita, I am just having some wine tonight. Some Witch's Brew spiced wine. I've been using these as like fidget spinners. These ones, they're kind of falling apart now, but I've had them for 30 years. I can't find proper replacements. So ones you buy online are always a little bit smaller. And they seem harder to me because they're smaller. My hands are so used to doing something just a little bit bigger than this. But, I don't know, they're just kind of fidget spinning. Hey, Cindy. Hey, Kathleen. Hey, Betsy. No, my folks will not be making Mystericon this year. Stuff comes up. These are the ones that I got from Grandma D, I believe. Well, good evening, everybody. Mystericon tomorrow. Hey, Debbie. Hey, Beth, that sounds good. Cider Fest. Eli and I went to this cider place in Burbank the other day that had a cherry mead. It was delicious. I love you with all my heart. Hey, Alexandra. Hey, Lisa. Oh, look at this. He's petting me. Or scratching me, anyway. Hey, Elaine. Ooh, pumpkin bread. That sounds good. Ooh, I should do that. Hey, Hispanic. I'll see you soon. Miles, you gonna get out the way, or? Guess not. All right. Welcome along, everybody. Miles, it's not shedding season. What are you doing all this shedding for? Hey, Nance. Phoenix. Hey, Cindy. What are you up to, Miles? What do you see? Hey, Dad. Hey, don't worry, Laura. I got you. Hey, Barbara. Miles. Look at ya. Sarah, yeah, we can switch the whole thing to be about coats. Aylin and Jill. Oh. Strike a pose, there's nothing to it. 1920s photo problem. Aha.
And they all loved it. They all loved those bastards when they played by Benny Goodman.
All right, we're going to let Benny Goodman do one more tune, then I'll get started properly. Now, Mount Trashmore in summer is a strange sight, especially if you only see it on this. Tickets still available for the boat tours. Hey, Tracy. After all, there's only one more sleep till Mystericon. Hey, Tracy. I about got my talk ready. It's gonna be cool. It's gonna be fun. Miles, be careful, okay? We're letting Benny Goodman finish up one more tune, then we'll get started. Welcome along, everybody. So, wish I was going or wish I were going? I'm never gonna win the grammar rodeo. Miles. Please just find your spot and relax, okay? You make it so hard for me to work here. I think I do all the work at the coffee shop. Aww. Octavio, the boat runs no matter the weather, but the rain is only supposed to be hitting like morning that day, so we should be all right. I had to like bargain with the bank and drop names of the district manager to get the boat paid off. It was weird. Hey, Emily.
Music by Benny Goodman.
All right, that is music by Benny Goodman, presented from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. We are going to be in that actual room. It doesn't look much like it used to anymore, but we're going to be in that actual room tomorrow, or Saturday, for Mystericon coming right up. All right, welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours, tour guide and historian here in Chicago for 20 years now, author of such books as Mysterious Chicago, the book, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, Murder Maps USA, Graceland Cemetery, Chicago Stories, Symbols, and Secrets. I was at Graceland yesterday. They were asking me, when are we going to do Volume 2? Like, well, okay. We could probably start talking about Volume 2. We've also got Just Kill Me, a novel about a ghost tour guide who makes places more haunted by killing people at them. And the Smart Alex Guide to American History, now badly out of date and almost out of print, I think, but somehow still chugging along. Who knows how these things work? But all right, tomorrow, once again, is Mystericon at the Congress Hotel. I'm going to do it, tomorrow is Find a Grave Friday in person. I will post in the morning, about 7 o'clock, where Find a Grave is going to be. It'll be close to Mount Olivet if you need directions for an approximate place to go, but I can't tell you everything ahead of time. All right, so, well, today we are going to be talking about more of a heavy topic than normal. We're going to be talking about times in Chicago when they might have hanged the wrong man. Now, approximately 100 men were hanged by the neck until they were dead judicially in Chicago between 1840, the first time it happened, and 1927, when they switched to the electric chair. Now, some people, when I bring this up at all, get very defensive immediately, saying, no, that would never happen. And really, let's just start by going back to Abraham Lincoln. Here's a little shot from Abraham Lincoln's house. Well, specifically, we're going to loop around here. About the only video footage I had of Abraham Lincoln's house was really the outhouse. This is a three-holer. So 3 people could be sitting there at the same time. How is that for efficiency? In any case, We're going to go back to Springfield, 1841. Here's Abraham Lincoln posing very much as he would have while sitting right about here. But there was a guy named Archibald Fisher who lived in a boarding house in Springfield, and one day Archibald Fisher disappeared. He had been suffering ill health ever since some kind of gun accident. It was something like he was just cleaning it and it went off, that kind of thing. But after the boarders in the boarding house noticed that he was gone, a man named Traylor confessed that he and his brothers had killed him. Now Lincoln said examinations were made of cellars, wells, and pits of all description where it was thought the body might be concealed. All the fresh or tolerably fresh graves at the graveyard were pried into, and dead horses were disinterred. But they didn't find any dead body. Now the brothers were put on trial for murder, and it was shown that the brothers had been spending money like sailors, as though our boys had done something rash. But Lincoln was one of the lawyers, and as a defense lawyer, he brought in just one single witness. That was a doctor who said that Fisher, the dead man, was in fact still alive and well and at home in Peoria. Now, later accounts, they would have Fisher, dramatically walking into the courtroom to surprise everybody. That's more of the kind of thing that happens on television than in real life. In reality, Fisher did come back to town, but not for a few years later. But on the evidence that he was still alive, and this being 1841, they couldn't just call the guy. But Lincoln ended up writing a whole true crime story about this later on. He said, the guy who drove the carriage, Mary was writing it at one point, and said it was too damned bad to have so much trouble and no hanging after all. But Lincoln noted that these brothers surely would have been hanged if it hadn't been for that one doctor who happened to have some information that this guy was in Peoria. There would very definitely have been a hanging about it. Lincoln himself even wrote a true crime story about it called A Strange Affair. Wrote about it in a letter to Josh Speed as well. So you might be wondering, didn't that guy confess? Well, there are those who will say that if nobody would ever confess to murder if they hadn't actually done it, but in fact that happens quite a bit. Now, one study said that there were about 350 known wrongful capital convictions between 1900 and 1985. In those, just about half involved a false confession. It happened a lot, usually under a few common conditions, like if people have been incarcerated for a long time, particularly without contact with their lawyers and in long interrogations. They'll say anything just to make that end. Or if the police falsely claim that they have evidence against somebody and confessing will make it easier for them. You run into that quite a bit. Or if the people are members of a vulnerable group, children, minority religions and races, the developmentally disabled, etc. And this is nothing of the police literally beating a confession out of somebody. In these days, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, the cases we're talking about today, police believed their job was to get a conviction, not necessarily to find the actual guilty party. And part of this was they figured if they didn't find somebody to hang, then the people would just resort to lynch law. So it seemed complicated. It was generally thought that it was worth executing people who might not really be guilty just to satisfy the public demand for law and order. So just a little bit of the basics here. This is the old jail in Chicago. We've been looking at here is the old criminal court that is still standing. Right behind it was the old jail, about where the fire station is now on Dearborn and Illinois streets. Now on the inside here is a diagram from 1885 showing the path from a cell to the gallows. The gallows would be set up not at all times. They were usually set up specifically for the hangings. And this is about the way that it looked. It was really just a scaffold and a beam with a trap door. Then in the back there you can see that thing that looks like a partition. It's a little bit two-dimensional here, but there was a little sentry box with a window where, at least according to most of the stories, the hangman would be standing. The sheriff would give a signal. The guy who was in there would enact some mechanism to cut a rope, and then the trapdoor would drop. Now, later it was said that there was never really anybody inside of that. It was really just something to take the heat off of the sheriff who was doing the actual work. Now, you can see the night before, they would hang bags of sand. This was to get the spring out of the rope, because he didn't want the body to fall and then bounce. You wanted it to be a nice straight job. And in the 19th century especially, you see this taper off a lot in the 20th, but in the 19th century, they tended to chronicle every cough and sputter. Sometimes they left certain things out. In earlier ones, they would mention that there was a copious emission from the condemned man's bladder. H.H. Holmes was buried without any pants, which leads us to suspect that that happened, though it wasn't actually written about in the time. As the 1800s progressed, they got a little bit more discreet. The Chicago Times famously had a headline, "Jerked to Jesus." This wasn't even a Chicago hanging. The Chicago Times just liked to write about hangings. Now, this is a case, what they were always concerned about, this is a case in Topeka, where a mixed-race crowd gathered to hang a man from a telegraph pole. It was a white man, which makes it a little bit different from the more famous lynching cases. But among the people in the crowd was Harry Olson, a law student who would eventually become an assistant state's attorney in Chicago and oversee quite a number of capital cases. He certainly believed, he never really commented on this that we know of, though he did hire Ida B. Wells, a noted anti-lynching advocate, and believed that by going through things more judicially and keeping people's faith in the law and order of the justice system, it would avoid scenes such as this. But that also led to a lot of people getting kind of rushed through and railroaded who may not have in fact been guilty. Now, in one case, we're going to cover one who managed not to be hanged at the last second. Moving ahead. This is the Vrazel family plot at Bohemian National Cemetery. Now, one by one in the early 1900s, the Vrazel family started to die, around 1908 or so. You can see Mary, Tilly, Rosa, Ella. One by one, these people fell victims of poisoning. And the police decided it must have been the family fortune teller, a guy by the name of Herman Billick. Now, they decided that Herman Billick had decided that he wanted to marry Mrs. Vrazel, and the best way to do it was to kill everybody off and get their farm and get their money. Now, really, a more logical suspect, perhaps, would have been Emma Vrazel, one of the daughters of the family, the one who never got sick. But the police decided it was easier to pin it on Herman. Now, even after Herman was in jail and another family member died of poisoning, Coroner Hoffman deliberately fudged the autopsy. He deliberately had them not check the organs that would have been telltale signs of arsenic poisoning, just because if it had turned out that somebody else in the family had been poisoned while Herman was in jail, Herman was probably not at least the sole suspect at the time. Once again, more likely a suspect would have been Emma, but it was already known in Chicago at this time. It was a running theme in the papers a lot that they never managed to convict women of murder, especially young and pretty women. So Herman Billick was a foreigner, which made it much, much easier. We'll see this again and again. So most of the testimony to convict him hemmed on the testimony of Jerry Vrazel, a son of the family, who said that he had seen Mr. Billick mixing up powders to give to somebody. However, later on, Jerry said that the whole thing was fake. When they brought Billick back into court, he said, "No, I only said that because the police said that if I didn't, they had evidence to hang me." So we can see right here, he's a member of a vulnerable group, children. Here the police falsely claimed they had evidence against him, and confessing would make it all easier for him. So in this case, Herman Billick was actually pardoned eventually. He didn't live much longer after that, but he had already been sentenced to be hanged when more of this evidence came out, and he was eventually let free. This was the subject of a very good book by Steve Shukas called Poisoned. He really dug into it, and he went into it thinking that Herman Billick had been a serial killer. He's kind of remembered in Chicago history as one of our serial killers, despite volumes of evidence saying that he probably hadn't been. The trouble is, he was going up against Coroner Hoffman. Coroner Peter Hoffman, shown here pretending that he has any idea what he's doing examining a hammer from the Dietz murder. This guy had no background in forensics or science whatsoever and was known to, like, a guy gets molten metal poured on him at a factory, dies. Coroner Hoffman says that he died of tuberculosis. This left the factories off the hook. He was working in tandem, of course, with Inspector George Shippey. These two honestly, the cases that I read of these guys, even people that I think were almost certainly guilty, at least everybody should have had their sentences commuted just because they were operating under these two. Shippey would eventually shoot a guy to death for knocking on his door while looking Jewish, and Hoffman would eventually become sheriff, but spend time in his own jail after he was convicted of getting bribes from gangsters. Here's an earlier days, around the time that all of this took place. This is them with Johann Hawk. Also Detective Michael Loftus. You got Shippey over on the left and Hoffman over on the right. Like, name this boy band. We'll go back a little bit further in history here, back to 1882. Well, really back to 1881, right around this alley here. The alley behind Black Hawk Street. In what is now approximately Wicker Park. Westtown, Wicker Park area. So this was kind of in the alley. But one night, a woman who lived on Black Hawk named Miss Glazier saw two men trying to break into a nearby house. Now, in the moonlight, she could see that one of them was wearing a Scotch cap. That was about it. But the owner of the house saw these guys and tried to shoot at them. They ran in through a partition and onto the next street. Let's cut into the partition here. We'll just be tracing their steps. Hey, there's taco stuff on the table for you.
All right.
Follow them through the partition. So the police didn't really have a suspect, but as they were running away, a police officer gave chase and was fatally shot. Now, the police didn't really have anything to go on as to who these would-be robbers might have been, so they just kind of rounded up the usual suspects. The 13th guy they arrested was a guy by the name of James Tracy. Now, James Tracy was a longtime burglar for sure, in addition to being a well-educated Civil War veteran. Mrs. Glazier, the closest thing to a witness, identified him as the man she had seen wearing a Scotch hat among the burglars. So, the story went around that he had told a fellow prisoner, well, I had to shoot or I would have gotten caught. But when asked about that at the trial, he said, do I look like an idiot? Of course he hadn't said something like that. And a lot of people wondered, could this have possibly been a case of mistaken identity? All that they really had was a woman who said that she saw him through a murky window in the dark under a hat. It's not exactly a good identification. So, he ended up writing a reasonably convincing account of his own innocence. He was convicted and sentenced to hang, and really just kind of blamed his attorney. He said it's not necessarily the attorney's fault, but if a man can only lift 100 pounds, you can't expect him to lift 200. Now, before his hanging, he wrote this very reasonable letter, and when asked if he was afraid of the gallows, he said, of course, I feel the shadow of the gallows resting on my head. I may not profess any affected sentiment of remorse and hopes for forgiveness, but I am not going to death with the desperate resolution which usually characterizes the common murderer. I feel my situation keenly. I dread the disgrace and ignominy of the gallows, the idea, not a fear to die. But here's the thing: he still went to the gallows bravely. It was like signing autographs for the kids and shouting out warnings to stay on your best behavior to the kids who were in jail. And there were quite a few boys. But the reason for this is he thought that he was going to be walking out of there. He knew he was being hanged, but there was a plan afoot that they were going to bring him back to life. A few of the doctors, including Walter S. Haynes, who would later testify against Johann Hawk after doing chemical analysis, took the body across the street to an office and pumped him full of electricity. And by their account, by Haynes' later account, they actually came pretty close. They said they got the color back in his cheeks, they got the heart beating again, they got his face twitching. It certainly seemed as though he were alive again. But his neck was broken, so they were never going to get him back up and walking around again or anything. But they had kind of established for their own purposes that this could be possible. That if a person were not hanged all the way, if they just strangled to death, there was just a chance that with the right equipment they could be brought back. We'll just check out his burial place here. He is in a section of Calvary Cemetery just over the line into Evanston. Okay, don't worry, guys. I just hit the block button on Gabriel. I don't know if that works on Restream, but it ought to. I just don't have a lot of patience for fuckers like that. All right, so we're going to move along a little bit here. Moving along into Little Italy. And up a couple of years to 1885. So, 1885, a trunk arrived in Pittsburgh containing the body of one Felipe Caruso. It was traced back to Chicago, and was traced back specifically to what was then Tilden Street. Among those arrested were a few guys named Giraldi, Silvestri, and Azari. So, the story went that they had found out that Felipe Caruso had saved up $145 as a fruit peddler. They lured him into a room to have a shave. In those days in the Italian community, men tended to shave each other. Then strangled him to death and mailed the body to Pittsburgh in a trunk. Now, they confessed in the police station, but how in the world anybody even got confessions is completely unclear. These guys spoke a Sicilian dialect that no one in the squad could translate. At the time, in fact, there was only one Italian man on the police force at all, and he didn't work on this case. One newspaper vaguely reported that the police relied on someone they called Dago Joe for translating. In any case, though there were convictions here, they met about all of the conditions that lead to false confessions. The witnesses only gave vague statements about them. These were members of what at the time was a vulnerable population. They were held without contact for a long time. How much they could have been threatened, given that they didn't really speak English, is anybody's guess, but I'm sure they came up with something. Possibly there were signs of physical abuse as well. One girl, their main witness, said that she had seen these guys with a trunk, but at the time that she said she saw them, she would have been in school. A furniture dealer said he'd sold them the trunk, but then he noted that he wasn't sure that it was them because he thought that all Italians looked alike. In any case, it was also May 1st, moving day, which was the typical day for leases to be up, and half of the city was moving. Trunks would have been everywhere. The condition of the body when it arrived in Pittsburgh indicated it had been dead for longer than that, and there was no sign of him being strangled, so it doesn't necessarily fit in with things. But they were given a very interesting team of lawyers. There was Kate Kane Rossi, the only woman lawyer in Chicago at the time, and a guy by the name of Bauman, who was the only black lawyer in the city at the time. Or the criminal, anyway. Kate had some really nasty things to say about him at various times. Kate was an interesting character, but that is a whole other tour. But she was not able to get these guys the fair trial that they deserved. I don't think anybody really could have. So they were all hanged together. Having a triple hanging like this was a new idea for them at the time, a new idea for Chicago. They probably had to expand the gallows a little bit. They were all hanged and also interred right in about that same section of Calvary Cemetery. There's recently been a book on this one by Elizabeth Dale called The Chicago Trunk Murder. And here's I'll scroll this up briefly. This is kind of your warning here. That's about all I got of it. I don't want it to be too gruesome even in this. But Azari's specific spot is right around here at Calvary. They're all generally in the same area in the south end of it, mostly unmarked. Of course, we'll only cover briefly that this is also right around the time, the next year, was the Haymarket incident, when the police were marching towards a rally for the 8-hour workday and against striking workers in the McCormick plant being killed. The cops started marching towards it the second the permit expired. A bomb went off. They never figured out who threw the bomb, but rather than really trying to, they just arrested really kind of anybody that they could, and 5 of them, even a few who they knew were not even present at the time, were sentenced to be executed. They were eventually pardoned. Governor Altgeld found no proper evidence connecting these guys to the crime. And this probably set the labor movement back. It was kind of a flashpoint. It was something people rallied around, but also the newspaper coverage made it very clear that the hanging of these guys made the world safe for democracy. There is now a monument to them at Forest Home Cemetery, which I wouldn't say was that progressive at the time. In the 1910s, they didn't start out as a segregated cemetery, but they became a segregated cemetery. Well, let's just cover a little bit here. There was a guy by the name of Judge Goggin. Now, amongst all of the various characters on the bench and the various characters in blue that we had in these days, Judge Goggin really stands out. The court in this days was very much in the habit of arresting boys just because they didn't like the look of them and sending them off to the Bridewell, the low-security prison, just kind of on suspicion. Judge Goggin frequently condemned them for this and said that he was writing a book about all the things that the police were doing. Always letting people off the hook because they'd been improperly arrested, was working on a big book, but then he died before it was finished, about 1896. Now, one of his more famous cases, there's one that I tell in Architecture of Mysterious Chicago. A guy was robbed by Kitty Wells in one of the red light districts, and he said, well, my biggest problem is you didn't have more money for them to steal. Here came this old steamboat paddling along full of whiskey, didn't get the services that he paid for, etc. We're going to move along a little bit over here. This is also approximately Little Italy, another space on Taylor Street. One of the haunts of a guy by the name of Buff Higgins. Now, in September of 1893, a guy named Peter McCooey was in bed when a noise woke him up. He stumbled out of bed and was shot to death by a burglar. 3 men were present. Buff Higgins was found underneath a raised sidewalk in a vacant lot nearby. Now, he denied any knowledge of the crime under what the newspapers called severe cross-examination, like examination with lightsabers, and was then taken to the house, shown the dead body where the police said, look at your work, look at what you have done. He denied it again, so they took him back to the Maxwell Street police station for more interrogations. Now, Judge Goggin later was the one who filled in the details on this. He said that what happened was they took him back to the police station, stripped him naked, locked him up without food or water for a couple of days. Then finally they opened the door, gave him a pint of whiskey to drink, then put a piece of paper in front of him and said, here, Buff, here's your alibi statement. Just sign this and you're free to go. He would have signed it with an X. He was far too drunk to be making negotiations like this, and also illiterate, so he wouldn't have known that this was actually a confession. But he was hanged based entirely on the basis of that signed confession, and is also in that same section of Calvary Cemetery. He was a cellmate of Patrick Pendergast, who was the guy who assassinated Mayor Carter Harrison. When Higgins was hanged, prisoners were heard to shout, "Hang the governor," instead. Pendergast was hanged, by all accounts was guilty, though even the jail physician said if it had been anybody else, he would have been found insane. He's clearly suffering from schizophrenia. We'll pop around here a little bit to Butch Lyons. Right around here on Van Buren Street, there was a guy by the name of Butch Lyons, right about at Jefferson and Van Buren, really. So about a block away from where we were in the video. And this is how it looked about 30 years after this. This is about 1930, but there was a guy by the name of Butch Lyons, as seen here in as seen here. This is another Judge Goggin story. Now, what happened was that he was accused of shooting a man that he was trying to rob. The guy died a couple of days later. The way Judge Goggin described it, and the way the witnesses describe it as well, Butch Lyons and a guy named Cornelius O'Brien were involved in some kind of a drunken brawl here on Van Buren with a guy by the name of Albert B. Mason, a landscape painter, who is now at Rose Hill, but I think he's unmarked. So, 1895, they got into a fight. At some point, Butch tried to grab Albert's gun. The gun went off and grazed him in the scalp, but not so badly that he died on the spot or anything, or even so badly that he stopped drinking for the night. The defense would later say that Mason was the one who attacked. He was just trying to shoo them off of the sidewalk. But the police said, no, this was definitely a robbery that just went too far. Now, Buff Higgins was convicted and sentenced to be hanged. During the appeals process, a saloon keeper showed up and said, yeah, I saw Mason that night. He came into my place bleeding from the head and very drunk and said, I guess I was trying to take up the whole sidewalk. I had a fight with Butch Lyons and I got the worst of it. But this had been kept from Butch Lyons. He didn't know about the saloon keeper's testimony until after the trial. And in fact, Albert B. Mason kept up the spree. He didn't die for a couple of days later. Might not have even been from the gunshot, really. But the story was that Lyons was grabbing for it and it went off. He could have just accidentally been shooting himself. The next morning, Mason was even reportedly said, "Oh, Lyons is all right. He didn't hurt me." But not enough witnesses heard him say that, and he couldn't very well repeat it after he died. Most of the witnesses were not even present at the trial. Lyons would later say, it was really, if I had more money for decent attorneys, this wouldn't have happened. Now, Lyons was just in his early 20s. He looks quite a bit older than that. But he'd been arrested for things like burglary and vagrancy an awful lot of times since he was 9. Now, the Chronicle said he was raised in a rookery of crime. Now, this is certainly the case. We're not trying to say that this was a good guy or anything, but the evidence against him was really quite slim. There's a drawing of him being marched to the gallows. Now, there was an account that the night before he just suddenly perked up smiling. He heard a newsboy outside shouting, "All about the hanging, extra, extra, all about the hanging." And Butch said, "Why, that's Kid McLafferty. He was always fresh. I'm not in the air yet." Now, only 11 months later, well, first of all, we'll just cover he, too, is in that section of Calvary Cemetery. But less than a year later, there was a prisoner who was jailed for debt and said he heard weird sounds in the jail. And one of the guards said, "Oh, that is the ghost of Butch Lyons. The rope broke and he died in agony, and he has haunted the jail ever since." Now, there's no account of the hanging of Butch Lyons that says that he died in agony or that the rope broke. This guard was probably confusing him with a case of a guy named George Painter that happened around the same time. We'll cover this. Here's George Painter wearing a fez. But he lived over on Green Street. And George Martin, in May of 1891, he was living on 21 South Green, about Green and Madison in modern numbers. He comes up on the Darker History of Madison Street tour. And it was living there the woman named Alice Martin, who was not actually his wife. This was a little less common back then, cohabitating like that. Both of them were said to be having affairs on the side, but one day, neighbors heard George Martin running around shouting, "Are all you people dead? Help, where is everyone? Someone has killed my Alice." Inside, Alice was found in bed, her face pounded beyond recognition. Now, these two had lived together for a few years, both were having affairs, and naturally, George Martin was brought in for the murder, though all of the evidence was entirely circumstantial. He said he came in and found her like that. Notably, his clothes did not have any bloodstains on them, which would have been remarkably tricky. They didn't find any bloodstains on any of the clothes, and they really should have been able to. Now, he was convicted in February of 1892, several months after the issue, but not hanged for about 2 years, because there just wasn't really that much evidence. The appeal dragged on and on and on, until finally the gallows were built. And in his case, he gave a big speech saying, "If I am guilty of this, may I go to hell in a minute when you hang me." This was the case where the rope did break. The rope broke and he landed on his head. He landed so hard they thought he was probably already dead, but the sentence said he must hang by the neck until he was dead, and by God, they were going to hang him by his neck until he was dead. So they hauled the body back up, tied the noose around it again, and slid it down the trap door and had it hang there for a minute just for appearances. But here's the thing, that was all 1893. Thereafter, a story went around. One guy was seen in the Clinton Hotel at the time of the night of the murder saying he just trimmed a woman on Green Street. 20 years later, a guy wrote to the police saying a guy named Jack Cadd had just confessed to him that he was the one who had killed Alice in jail. Now, whether this guy, Jack Cadd, was telling the truth, we'll never really know, but this was one that came up quite a bit. Like, thereafter, in an awful lot of different cases, of capital cases and attempts at clemency, they would bring this up as a case where they had, in fact, hanged the wrong man. Whether they really had or not, I'm not entirely convinced myself. But at one point, Painter offered to be hypnotized. There was kind of a belief at the time that hypnotized people could only tell the truth. And this is something you run into a lot in late 19th and early 20th century cases, is hypnosis comes up in crime reports a lot. Sometimes they're treating it as a supernatural thing, sometimes they're treating it as a scientific thing, and other times they're saying hypnosis, but they really just kind of mean persuaded, duped into, what we would now call gaslighting, just mind games in general. We're going to move over here to Lincoln Park. There's a similar case with where hypnosis comes up. 1906, a woman named Bessie Hollister, living here at Belden and Burling, went missing. Relatives reported that she was slightly demented and tended to wander off. This is about how it looked at the time. You see, there's a little bit of similarity, a couple of buildings still standing. But right about in the middle of this was a little barn. And one day, a kid named Richard Ivins, a teenager, walked into the barn and found the dead body of Mrs. Hollister. So he panicked, ran home, told his dad what he had found. His father went to the police, and the police immediately got suspicious that he had sent his father to do all of this. So they arrested him, and by he confessed. Let's see, his place was down the road a little ways from here. This house is actually still standing right here on Halstead. But immediately the paper started calling him Murderer Ivins. Now, he did confess, but it had been quite a long time. And of course, Shippey was involved, and so was Hoffman. Harry Olson was too in this case. But eventually there was a guy named J. Iverson Christensen who wrote a whole pamphlet on this called How an Innocent Man Was Hypnotized to the Gallows. So he noticed that there was a lot of problems with this. Now, even taking hypnosis out of it, the decomposition of food in the dead woman's stomach shows that the timing was off. Ivins' version of the events that they had him confessing to had him doing like single bounds over 6-foot fences, not to mention performing sexual feats that would be beyond the powers of most people. 13 witnesses put Richard at his house at the time of the murder. The murder also must have taken place the next morning based on the food in the stomach, etc. The confession really doesn't clear things up very much. And it was kind of determined within the pamphlet that it was a very good chance. Hypnosis is not the word we would want to use for this now. It was persuaded. They messed with his mind. They played a lot of mind games until finally he was told that if you don't confess, you're going to be hanged anyway. If you do confess, maybe we can make this work for you. So this is a picture. The problem with the pamphlet is it kind of puts it in the realm of hocus pocus stuff. He would like show a picture like this and say, isn't this picture proof that he was hypnotized? Look into his eyes. That kind of stuff just doesn't work. These kind of mind games were not necessarily considered out of bounds at the time. Let's see, move some things around here. It's another building that is still standing. So this is an old streetcar garage that is now, last I was there anyway, it was a coffee shop. June of 1895, a guy named Carrie Birch was murdered here in the car barn. And the people at the coffee shop told me they do believe the place is haunted. They'd never heard the story about a murder taking place there, but well, I was able to fill them in on this. Initial reports said that one person shot him while he was working on getting the safe open, getting the day's cash locked up, but 2 kinds of bullets had been used. So, after a bit of a manhunt, they captured a guy by the name of Julius Mano and a guy by the name of Joseph Windrath. Now, Windrath acted completely insane in jail. He was convicted partly because they believed he couldn't be both depressed and demented. They didn't know too much about mental health in those days. So on the scaffold, he was just babbling incoherently. Reporters decided he was saying bad box, put him in the bad box, or something like that. Now, a month later, Mano was hanged. Right before, he wrote a letter saying that not only did he take full responsibility for the crime, but he also complained that he pleaded guilty at the trial specifically because the police told him that if he pleaded guilty, he would just get life in prison, not the gallows. But it was also why he had implicated Windrath. He had said, I said that Windrath was there with me because they said they already had the evidence, and if I didn't confess, they'd be hanging both of us. He now claimed that not only was he responsible for the crime, but Windrath, who had already been hanged for it, wasn't even there that day. So the judge later said, well, you can take my word or you can take the word of a confessed murderer. And Mano replied on the scaffold, better a confessed one than an unconfessed one, like the judge. I was buncoed into this plea as the greenest of Granger ever was in the shell game. I have no more show than a fly who gets into a spider's web. Judge Horton was the spider. He is also in that section at Calvary Cemetery now. And here's another shot of Mano. We'll cover one more, a little over time. We're going to go down Garibaldi Place here on Taylor Street. Well, it is now, there's not really a Garibaldi Place anymore. It's just a little bit of the street is left that is really just a parking lot and an alley for a convenience store. But this, once upon a time, was an entire place. And down this street lived a guy named Antonio Lopez in 1920. Right over here near Hull House, he and his some friends went into a grocery store one day for some cigars and supplies. But one of his friends started complaining to the clerk, then eventually drew a gun and started shooting at the tomato cans. You can make your own references to the jerk here. Ended up shooting the owner. Lopez just froze in place as the dead man's son pounced on him and beat the snot out of him. There was almost nothing to really suggest that Lopez had anything to do with this. He was just present with a guy who, by all accounts, just happened to be feeling that way without warning. Most witnesses say that he didn't even come into the store with them. He just kind of came in minutes later when he heard the commotion. There was no gun found on him. There was little evidence that he actually had one. But some witnesses said that he'd handed the gun off to somebody while the shooting was going on. Now, this was an interesting one to look up. I was looking up a whole other case when I came upon this at the archives down in Springfield. And the clemency file was very interesting. It had a whole diagram of the grocery store. And this is, I'll just show you the scale of this. Here's Aiden and his friend, who were my research assistants that day, holding it up. That was pretty cool. Now, really, the evidence against him was not great, but at the time he spoke almost no English. In jail, though, he got convicted and took it pretty well. He joked around a lot and made a big point of impersonating a rooster every chance he got. They called him the Chanticleer of Murderers Row. When he was taken to the death cell, he paused at the door and did a rooster call, then said, "I'm going to crow on the platform tomorrow." Nobody ever did that before. But then there was a reprieve. There were multiple reprieves, and he was very quietly hanged. Was apparently just saying something about being innocent to a deputy, too quiet to be heard. Begged to be shot by a firing squad instead of being hanged. But if he got around to the crowing like a rooster, it wasn't written down. Well, all right. Well, okay, everybody. A quick plug for the upcoming stuff. You all know Mystericon is coming up. Tomorrow we have got boat tours. There's also, that was last week's Graceland Cemetery. There's another one coming up the week after this. Lots of interesting stuff coming up here. There always is. But most of all, Mystericon. Still some pace left on the boat tours on Saturday night. We've got events all day at the Congress Hotel on Saturday. Tomorrow morning, Find a Grave Friday. I'll tell you where it's going to be at 7 o'clock in the morning. It's close to Mount Olivet if you need directions to someplace to gauge how long your drive is going to be. So, all right, everybody. Once again, I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. We'll put the Benny Goodman on, and let's hang out for a few minutes, shall we?
Is being presented from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. And now Benny Goodman's arrangement of The Bugle Call Rang.
Yeah, I've seen that troll who came in has popped in a couple of times, I know. So I'm not taking any prisoners with trolls right now. I ain't got time for idiots. Especially ones who I've never seen do anything here but troll. Well, as Bob Dylan wrote in a song in 1962, it was long ago, far away. Things like that don't happen nowadays. How much extra time do we need to leave there to get there? Almost none. I'm not going to make this difficult on you guys. It's right near Mount Olivet. There are several cemeteries right around there. said that he knew me? I don't know. He says he knows me personally? From where? That much more so. People come in saying stuff like that. I don't want people thinking I'm their friend. Thanks, April. I know that there's, I think he's the guy who's been in here trolling a couple of times and comes in talking about Scamala. Well, I don't have time for that crap. Kathy, I've only done this one twice, and the last was over a year ago. Sherry, we had about 100 people hanged in Chicago. I would conservatively estimate that 20% of them were innocent. But it's just an estimate because it's not like the police were ever going to come out and say, oh, we screwed that one up. Good night, Betsy. Okay, I do see in my files he was on a virtual tour I did, not even one of these ones, but for another company 4 years ago. All right, Beth. Welcome to the Congress. All right, Jeannie. Looking forward to seeing your husband. Good night, April.
Down Harlem Way, they're all trucking. And here's Helen Ward to tell you all about it. Trucking.
Let me know, but I don't have everybody's names on file, but I can see who I've emailed with. And if I'd known the guy, I probably would have more messages from him. I'm not much for surveillance. Like, on the Patreon, all I get on Patreon is people's email addresses. I don't get anybody's building information or anything. Well, yeah, I can see who I've gotten donations from, because I always get an email about that, and I keep all my emails. Hey, Frosty. Good night, Kristen. Thank you for that, Pat. Everybody's trucking. Trucking. Hey, Chris. We already had plenty of adventure with Miles earlier. Miles is presently over here on the couch, blending right in. Aren't you, Miles? See, now look. All right. I will try to get things live streaming during Con Day on Saturday. All right, yeah, those of you in the storm saying be safe. Live streaming should be on this site on Saturday. But all right, everybody, 7 o'clock in the morning, I'll post exactly which cemetery we are going to be at. It'll be very nearby Mount Olivet. So, all right, thank you very much for joining me, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. See some of you tomorrow morning, and until then, stay safe, stay strong, and stay spooky.